So good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's a privilege for us at St. John's Law School to be co-sponsoring this event with the Historical Society of New York Courts. And you're going to hear a lot from me later, so I will immediately turn things over to one of the trustees of the Historical Society, in fact, one of the featured honorees tonight, but more about her later. Retired Court of Appeals judge, St. John's Law grad, current partner at Greenberg Traurig. Please welcome Judge Carmen Ciparick.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Dean Simons. He just promoted me. I'm not a partner. I'm of counsel and enjoying myself. So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here tonight among so many friends from my St. John's family, of course, my Historical Society family, of which I am a trustee and the former chair, and of course my Court of Appeals family. So how lovely that the Historical Society of the New York Courts and St. John's Law School have come together to celebrate, as Dean Simons wrote in his invitation to me, the quote, the deep connection between St. John's Law and the New York State court system. And thank you so much to Professor Barrett and our sister in the federal court, Honorable Mary Kay Vyskocil, and the former presiding Justice of the Appellate Division, Second Department, the Honorable Randall T, and all responsible for putting this program together. Tonight, we're looking back at our time in law school as well as our careers in the court. And of course, we must look back to our wonderful benefactor, the great Governor Mario Cuomo, who appointed three of us, three St. John's grads, to the Court of Appeals, Judges Vito Titone, Judge Joseph Bellicosa, and myself. And in fact, those of you who attended my induction in January of 1994 may recall the governor praising the merit selection system that wrought three St. John's graduates. He was very proud of that. Judge Titone retired from the bench and went into private practice. Judge Bellicosa also retired and became dean of this great law school. Then came Judge Ted Jones, appointed by Governor Eliot Spitzer, who served much too briefly and suddenly, most sadly, left us. I retired at the end of 2012, leaving no St. John's member on the Court of Appeals bench. But gladly, our present governor, Andrew Cuomo, in his great wisdom, appointed our spectacular chief judge, the Honorable Janet DiFiore, to the court, where she serves now so graciously and grandly. So I'm thrilled to be here. Little did I dream when I joined the St. John's Law School Evening Division class in February of 1964, before most of you were even born, at 96 Skirmahorn Street, that 30 years later I would be on the Court of Appeals, and here we are 55 years later. Hard to believe. Well, we're here to celebrate ourselves and our joint accomplishments. Thank you for this great honor and for attending tonight. And I will sit down and turn the program over to our most distinguished professor, John Q. Barrett, professor of law here at St. John's, a Justice Robert H. Jackson Scholar, and a trustee of our Historical Society of the New York Courts. Enjoy the program and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Ciparick. Good evening, friends. Thank you all for being here. I am pleased to welcome you to this special law school where I've been on the faculty for nearly 25 years, and also to welcome you as a trustee of a special organization that preserves, teaches, and incubates next chapters in the history of the courts of the state of New York, and also as an advisor to our student chapter of the Historical Society. I'd like the past and present student officers of that chapter to stand and be recognized. Welcome and thank you in particular to alumni and students, to Chief Judge DiFiore, to Judges Bellicosa, Ciparick, Kay Vyskocil, and to my excellent deans, Mike Simons, and may I repeat myself, Joe Bellicosa. I will speak briefly this evening, paving a bit the path to the main event of Dean Simons' lecture. My topic is St. John's University School of Law, once new, now historic, including as a path to achievement in the New York courts. The Vincentian community opened St. John's College, a men's college in Brooklyn in 1870. In 1906, St. John's received a charter that elevated the school to university status. On September 28, 1925, St. John's opened a school of law. Press reports at the time indicated that two founding fathers had persuaded the Vincentian fathers to open a law school. One was Dr. George Matheson, and the other was Philip A. Brennan. This slide is hard to see, but if you could read the fine print, you would see that Mr. Brennan is not only a law degree holder, but a medical doctor. And he was very involved in St. John's, starting not only this law school, but earlier its School of Commerce and its schools of pharmacy. They persuaded the Vincentians that there was a market to serve, that would-be law students, including many immigrants, both men and women, were unable to enroll in the schools that then existed. The Vincentians, persuaded, opened a law school. Initially, it was entirely a night school program, and most of its degrees were conferred on undergraduates. Initially, the law school held classes in the Terminal Building at 50 Court Street in Brooklyn, pictured here. Classes filled so quickly that expansion was necessary almost immediately. Notice Court Street, which is in this photograph, the courts of Brooklyn. In other words, the courts, especially the grand courts of the state of New York. This is the appellate division of the Second Department in the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood in its beauty today. The School of Law was surrounded by courts, by litigation of all types, and these were worlds of opportunity and achievement for young St. John's students become graduates. They became prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys. They practiced civil law of all types. They became law secretaries. Philip Brennan, our founding father, who I just mentioned, himself became a justice of the New York State Supreme Court in 1933, and that is an interesting path to the court. But more interesting is that he immediately employed his nephew, John T. Brennan, graduate of the class of 1932, as his first law secretary. And in short order, those St. John's law graduates in the court environment started to become judges, to take the bench in city, county, trial, and appellate courts. Judges were an important part of St. John's education and environment long before alumni took the bench, however. This was true at the very top of the New York courts. For example, this fellow, shown in 1920, was a leading jurist in the state of New York. Alas, he was a Columbia Law School product because there was no St. John's option available to him at the time. Of course, that is Benjamin Nathan Cardozo. In 1928, as Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals, Chief Judge Cardozo was this School of Law's first commencement speaker, delivering a famous, deeply impressive, enduring address called Our Lady of the Common Law. Judge Cardozo loved that job, Chief, your job, dearly. He left it reluctantly 4 years later in 1932 when duty called him someplace else, where in the end he was much less happy. And this somewhat stunned photo is his last day on the job in 1932 at the New York Court of Appeals before he was forced by Senate action to assume a Supreme Court seat in Washington. But high judicial content and examples and opportunities do not solve all practical problems. From 1926 onward, the school's second year, it confronted space problems. It responded by leasing additional space in neighboring buildings, and soon even they overflowed. So then the School of Law moved into a new 14-story building at 96 Skirmahorn Street in downtown Brooklyn, pictured here. And that school, during its decades, taught many of our leading alumni. They included the benefactors who made this building possible, Leon Finley of the class of 1929, and Jerome Belson with his wife Maxine, Jerome of the class of 1948. They, like most St. John's graduates, statistically did not become judges. Most pursued other paths, as of course statistically will be true of any law school. Those non-judges produced by this School of Law included Hugh Carey, who of course served in uniform and then served in the governor's office in Albany. They include Roy Reardon, pictured on the left, a little hard to see, arguing for General Motors in his capacity as a leading appellate attorney in all courts across the country at Simpson Thacher, and on the right in his charming, guiding, teaching persona, which we're lucky to have to this day. But Brooklyn was, of course, crowded, growing, thriving Brooklyn. And if you look down in the center left, you see the arrow pointing to the St. John's building, again, kind of being hemmed in. Space limits confront the School of Law. But this was a time when the school had options. They existed, perhaps, because somebody played golf with an eye on real estate. Look, for example, at this property. It is New York City's Hillcrest Golf Club. It might seem to your eyes a little bit boggy and uninteresting, but you happen to be sitting in it. Because someone connected to St. John's University had better eyes than a person who saw merely a bog or a fairway. As early as 1936, through whatever process, still somewhat mysterious to me, St. John's acquired this land in Jamaica, Queens. It was this site, then the Hillcrest Golf Club, and as more and more people became automobile owners and drivers in New York, thank you, Robert Moses, it was conveniently located just off the Grand Central Parkway. It was adjacent to Jamaica Estates, a lovely neighborhood where, say, an apartment building developer could choose to build a grand house and raise loving, thoughtful children who would grow up to spend hope, kindness, and honesty across this nation and the world. To be specific, Jamaica Estates is where Fred and Mary Trump, who already lived nearby, built this house on Midland Parkway, just around the corner, and raised their children, none of whom attended St. John's University. In 1954, St. John's broke ground to move the university to this property in Queens. It began to turn the former golf course into this campus. And as a trailing component of the university, in 1970, the School of Law broke ground for this building, this half of the building that would become the School of Law. It moved here in 1972 and has been here ever since. In 1994, this building was doubled in size and modernized with the expansions that you will be in later tonight when you're in the atrium. Through all of these years, a big and proud part of our legacy has been judges. As I said, this has been the case throughout all levels of the courts of the state of New York. But I want to highlight some alumni who in the past have served as justices of the appellate divisions of the New York State Supreme Court and or as presiding justices on those courts. And this is a list of illustrious alumni. The first was Frank Galata of the class of 1932, who served in the Second Department from 1971 to 1983. Next came Milton Mullen of the class of 1950, who was appointed to the Second Department in 1976 and became its presiding justice, serving from 1978 until 1990. Guy Mangano of the class of 1955 succeeded Judge Mullen in that role. Judge Mangano was appointed to the Second Department in 1979, and he was the PJ from 1990 until 2001. His classmate John F. Lawton, class of 1955, served on the appellate division of the Fourth Department in Western New York State from 1986 until 2000. Justice Randall T was appointed to the Second Department in 2008, and he served as the presiding justice from 2012 until 2017. Justice Daniel Angelillo was appointed to the Second Department and served from 2006 to 2013. James Catterson of the class of 1985 was appointed to the First Department bench and served from 2004 until 2012. And Justice Alan Schenkman, class of 1975, was appointed to the Second Department as PJ last year and serves with distinction with in active service two other alumni, Judge Ronaldo Rivera of the class of 1976 and his classmate, Justice Ruth Balkin, also on the Second Department. 5 other alumni, of course, the ones we principally focus on tonight, have served on various courts and up the ladder and in this room, the chambers of the New York Court of Appeals. We salute them especially, but we are also here tonight to make history, to see young talent, to predict high achievement, including judicial service ahead. And so, in a reverse move, call this kind of a selfie. I focus on you, and particularly the younger, the students among you. I focus on you who will be in Carnesecca and become graduates of this law school next May and each year after that, graduating from this School of Law, going on to careers and achievements, and becoming future St. John's alumni judges. We are lucky that both St. John's and the Historical Society of the New York Courts will incubate that talent and then teach those achievements, that history still to come to all who will be following all of these long and high judicial paths. And we look forward to a successor program of this variety to celebrate your successors some decades hence. Thank you all very much. It's my pleasure to introduce my fellow trustee on the Historical Society Board, the former presiding justice of the Appellate Division, 2nd Department, Judge Randall Eng.
And thank you, Professor Barrett, Chief Judge DiFiore, Dean Simons, Judge Ciparick, Judge Bellicosa, Dean Bellicosa, or just Joe, but we all know, and Judge Vyskocil. It's a great pleasure for me to be home. And in just the few moments that I have, I'm going to reflect on why this is home to me and why this is my professional home. I came to St. John's University School of Law in the fall of 1969. And in the fall of 1969, I had a choice to make, and that is, which of these law school acceptances do I take? Do I go to Brooklyn Law School? Do I go to Fordham Law School? Or do I go to St. John's? I lived in Queens then, and I had to drive by the site of our present law school every day on my way to school when I went to St. John's in the Brooklyn campus. But in making my judgment, I looked, of course, at the other schools. Brooklyn Law School in 1969, brand new, state-of-the-art building, just a block or two from St. John's 96 Schermerhorn. Fordham in Lincoln Center, an ideal location there, right in the cultural capital there of New York, and then St. John's, 96 Schermerhorn Street. The building opened in the 1920s. They were going to move to Queens. It was getting run down. Some of the seats weren't even intact, as I recall. The library was getting a little tattered over there. And I said to myself, well, I have to make a choice, and it's got to go deeper than just architecture. So what did I do? I looked at the tradition of St. John's, the history of St. John's, and I saw what the mission of the Vincentians was and how they assisted so many emerging groups in finding their place in society and in the law. And I did some homework, and I noted that the only Asian American law professor in New York at that time, Kenneth Wong, was a member of the faculty here. And I said, this is tremendous. He's been on the faculty since the 1950s. There must be something very special about this place that would welcome an Asian law professor, actually one of a kind at that time. Then I did some further research. It seems that the first Chinese American admitted to the bar in New York State in 1935, Thomas Lee, was a St. John's grad. So I said, there's something about St. John's that will elevate me, will lift me, and will give me the opportunity to reach my full potential. So I chose St. John's, and I've never looked back since. St. John's has been wonderful to me. It got me from being an insecure law student to eventually becoming presiding justice of the 2nd Department. And I even had a chance once to sit with Chief Judge DiFiore in the Court of Appeals. So I had a wonderful judicial career, and I have to say that there was more to it than just, a foundation that was historically established. Along the way, I have to say that two of the most significant mentors that I had in my career that got me in the law at that time were two St. John's graduates. And they were both named Tom, and they were both former police officers, and they were both of Irish heritage. But that's where the coincidences stop. They were different, and yet they were the same. The first Tom was the Honorable Thomas J. Mackle. He was a district attorney of Queens County, and he appointed me as an assistant in 1972, and I became then the first Asian American assistant district attorney in New York State history. The other Tom was the Honorable Tom Manton, and Tom Manton was the Queens Democratic chair. He was a member of Congress, and he was an evening student as well at St. John's Law. He took a chance on me and supported me for a Supreme Court nomination. So I became then one of the first two Asian American Supreme Court justices in New York, and then my career progressed from there. And I've always had St. John's interns. I've always valued the counsel of the faculty at St. John's. I was privileged to serve as an adjunct faculty member for a number of years. I gave a commencement address, and I've always seen St. John's as my legal home, with a career that's run 46 years and still going. I remember that I had an inspiration when I was on the faculty as an adjunct, and I said, I'm going to bring the court to the academy. That's something that had not been done to my knowledge. So I, at the time, and you have to be in certain positions to get things done. I happened to be the administrative judge of the criminal term of Queens Supreme Court. And I said, I'm going to bring a trial to this beautiful courtroom here. This courtroom, of course, has always been state-of-the-art, and I had the perfect case. It happened to involve an illegal dumping case, and the defendants were corporations. Therefore, I could have a criminal trial. I didn't have to worry about security. There'd be all kinds of interesting exhibits and infrared photography and drone photography and everything else. Well, I put it all together, and wouldn't you know, the defendants took a plea. And that's the only time that I, as a trial judge, was very unhappy about a 3-defendant case that would have lasted probably 2 weeks or so, ending in a disposition. So that I was thwarted there. Last anecdote, and that is that I said, well, how about the appellate division? Because 13 years later, I found myself on the appellate division. I became PJ. And again, when you're PJ, when you're the boss, you can do things. And with the assistance and the support of Dean Simons, we brought the appellate division to St. John's, and we sat here. We sat here in the Belson Moot courtroom, and we had a full calendar of regular business here. And I'm happy to say that we had no problem in populating our bench with St. John's law grads. I had my 3 colleagues with me, and we heard a whole calendar of cases. So that, in a nutshell, is my experience at St. John's. And I have to say that I would not be here, and having enjoyed the positions that I've held, the experiences that I've had, the friendships that I've made, without having had the nurturing environment here at St. John's, both academically, spiritually, and I've made a whole host of lifetime friends. So I thank everyone for attending this evening's proceedings, and I love the Historical Society, I love St. John's, and I love the courts. Thank you.
So I still remember that conversation with Judge Ang about bringing the second department here to the law school. It was a conversation that Judge Rivera and I had had for years, going back long before I was dean. And then I become dean. We're at an event up in the atrium. I forget what the event was, but Judge Ang grabbed me by the elbow and he said, "Go over here, I have an idea. Wouldn't it be great if we could bring the second department to sit here at the law school?" And I remember saying, well, my first thought was, God, we've been talking about that for a long time. How are we going to make it happen? And then I said, wait a minute. You're the PJ. I'm the dean. Let's make this happen. Right? And when you're the dean, sometimes you can do stuff like that. The other thing that happens when you're the dean is sometimes you get given assignments. And I've been given the assignment of giving the main presentation about the 5 legal luminaries that we're focusing on tonight. The 5 St. John's law grads who've sat on the Court of Appeals, and I am thrilled to do that and to tell this story. And for me, the story starts in 1928, more than 90 years ago, when St. John's Law School graduated its first class from this building. You saw it in Professor Barrett's presentation, in downtown Brooklyn. And that's when this story begins, because it was just less than a year later, also in Brooklyn, when a young Italian couple named Vito and Elena Titone gave birth to their 3rd child, whom they called Vito Jr. That same year, 2 childhood sweethearts, Eduardo Beauchamp and Patria Comas, moved from Puerto Rico to the Upper Manhattan neighborhood of Washington Heights, where they were among the first settlers from the island of enchantment to make their home in the Heights. And 13 years later, their daughter Carmen was born. Around the same time, a young Italian immigrant named Frank Bellicosa met and wooed and married Antoinette Tullow. Frank was a union laborer. He hauled ice for a living. Antoinette was a seamstress. They lived in Bed-Stuy. And in 1937, Antoinette gave birth to their first son, Joseph. And living not far from there, in Crown Heights, in Brooklyn, was an African-American couple named Theodore Jones and Hortense Parker. Theodore worked on the Long Island Railroad. Hortense was an educator. And in 1943, Hortense gave birth to their 3rd child, and they named him Teddy. And finally, about 12 years later, in Mount Vernon, New York, just over the border from the Bronx, an Italian-American couple, immigrants themselves, gave birth to their only child, Janet DiFiore. Now, each of those children would find their way to this law school, actually most of them to that law school in Brooklyn. And that law school was founded in 1925 precisely for students like them. Children of immigrants, strivers seeking the American dream, for students who've been shut out of other opportunities because of their religion or class or race or ethnic background. And the story I'm going to tell today is one of just that, of opportunity, of breaking barriers, and of serving the public. In 1925, as Professor Barrett mentioned, when St. John's Law opened its doors, the school newspaper noted that the first class contained, quote, every nationality, creed, cult, age, and section of the city, making the law school the most democratic in the city. And that's Democrat with a small d, although some Democrats with a large D will play an important role later in this story. And although the school was part of a Catholic university, that first class was filled with Jewish students. That first class also had 800 students in it. They didn't all graduate. This is a picture of just one section. The first class had 30 women in the middle of the 1920s. The law school graduated its first Hispanic graduate in 1929, its first African-American graduate in 1931, and a few years after that, as Judge Eng noted, the first Asian-American lawyer in all of New York State, Thomas Lee. That spirit of diversity and inclusion and opportunity, of ascension spirit, persists in the law school to this day and is exemplified by these 5 New Yorkers. So let's fast forward to 1953, when a young Vito Titone started at the law school. Fresh off 2 years in the Army, he soon found and bonded with another child of Italian-American immigrants. They'd studied together, they double dated with the 2 women who would become their wives, and they would be important to each other's careers. That classmate was Mario Cuomo, who would go on to become the 52nd governor of New York. And if the first theme of this story is opportunity and breaking barriers and the American dream, the second theme is Mario Cuomo. Now, it was natural that Titone and Cuomo would bond. Like now, then prejudice against immigrants was prevalent, and that prejudice imposed barriers to participation in the legal profession at the highest levels. In fact, Judge Titone used to like to tell the story that a well-meaning law school administrator called Vito and Mario into his office and told them that despite their obvious talents, they would never get anywhere if they kept using those first names. Well, Vito Titone didn't change his name. He graduated from the law school in 1956, married his sweetheart Margaret later that year, and soon hung out a shingle with a partner. Maltese and Titone in Manhattan would be his professional home for the next dozen years, while his actual home would be in Staten Island, where Margaret was from. Judge Titone used to like to joke that he married into Staten Island. And that didn't stop him, though, from getting involved in Staten Island politics. And he was soon elected to the New York State Supreme Court, 1968. He'd spent 6 years on the trial court before being designated in 1975 to the Appellate Division Second Department. The PJ at the time was a judge whose picture you've already seen, Milt Mullen, St. John's class of 50. And the governor who appointed Judge Titone to the Appellate Division was Hugh Carey, St. John's class of 51. Now, while Judge Titone was serving on the Supreme Court and the Appellate Division, Joe Bellicosa was starting his career in the court system. Joe had been educated in Catholic schools in Brooklyn, spent 6 years in seminary prep before deciding that his vocation lay elsewhere, in his marriage to Mary and a career in the law. And Joe arrived at the law school, still in Brooklyn, in 1959. A star student, he was an editor of the Law Review, which gave him occasion to edit an article about the jurisdiction of the Court of Appeals, written by a young lawyer named Mario Cuomo. After a couple years in private practice, Joe made his way into the court system, serving as a law assistant, and ultimately the law secretary to Judge Marcus Christ in the Appellate Division Second Department, beginning Joe's deep immersion in and lifelong devotion to both the New York State court system and judicial administration. In 1970, Joe left the court system to return to alma mater, and you'll see there's a recurring pattern here, to join the faculty, teaching criminal law, criminal procedure, professional ethics, civil procedure, and legal writing. He also served as assistant dean to Dean John Murphy, a role that put him in charge of the law school's move from the Brooklyn campus at 96 Schermerhorn Street to the Hillside campus here, and that is a picture of the law school right after it opened in 1972. During his time on the faculty, he rekindled his relationship with another teacher of legal writing, Mario Cuomo. In 1974, Charles Breitel, then Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, convinced Joe to come back into public service and back into the court system, this time as Chief Clerk of the Court of Appeals and eventually counsel to the Court of Appeals. It was a big decision for Joe to move his young family up to Albany, a decision made easier by the fact that his friend Mario Cuomo was also moving to Albany because Cuomo had been appointed Secretary of State by Governor Hugh Carey. For the next dozen years, Joe immersed himself in judicial administration, helping Judge Breitel run the court, and then, when he became Chief Administrative Judge, helping Judge Breitel run the court system. Now, while Joe was helping to run the court system, one of that system's rising stars was a fellow St. John's alum, Carmen Ciparick. Carmen had arrived at the law school in 1964, after graduating from George Washington High School in Washington Heights, and then from the tuition-free all-female Hunter College at the City University of New York. After college, she became a teacher at a junior high school in Central Harlem, teaching social studies and phys ed, and then she enrolled in law school at night. There were only 8 women in her entire class and only 3 in the night section. When she graduated in 1967, only 3% of the nation's lawyers were women, and very few of them were judges. Carmen began her legal career as a staff attorney with the Legal Aid Society. And she soon joined the court system as well in 1969. First as a counsel to the Judicial Conference of the State of New York, a precursor to the Office of Court Administration, and then as the chief law assistant for the New York criminal courts in New York City and the Supreme Court criminal branch, as well as counsel to the administrative judge for New York City courts. If that makes it sound like she was running the criminal court system for New York City, she was, as a very young woman. Along the way, she married her husband, Joe, and Carmen Beauchamp became Carmen Ciparick. And then in 1978, Carmen Ciparick became Judge Ciparick, when Mayor Ed Koch appointed her to the New York City Criminal Court, making her the first Puerto Rican woman to serve on the bench in New York State history and one of the youngest judges in the state at the time. She would go on to serve in the Supreme Court in Bronx and Manhattan in both criminal and civil parts. Now, while Judge Ciparick was making her way through the law school at night and teaching during the day, Ted Jones was making his way through the jungles of Vietnam as an Army officer. After being born in Brooklyn, Ted had grown up in Queens, going to Shimer High School right here in Jamaica, then graduating from John Adams High in Ozone Park. It was in junior high that Ted met Joan Hogans, who would become his wife. Ted then left New York for college, the only one of our 5 judge honorees to do that, going to Hampton University in Virginia. It was at Hampton that Ted joined the Omega Psi fraternity and the Reserve Officers Training Corps of the Army. He graduated Hampton in 1965 as an Omega Psi brother and a second lieutenant in the Army. He'd go on to spend 2 years in Vietnam, returning home in 1969 as a captain. Captain Jones then enrolled at St. John's Law, just as Carmen Beauchamp was graduating, and just as Assistant Dean Bellicosa was returning. Ted graduated in 1972, just before the law school moved to Queens, and began his career as a legal aid lawyer in Brooklyn. And then in 1975, right after Joe Bellicosa left for Albany, Ted Jones hung out his shingle in downtown Brooklyn. His office was on Fulton Street, but he was very much a Court Street lawyer, as Professor Barrett pointed out in his earlier picture, and a good one at that, practicing criminal law and criminal defense for almost 15 years. And then in the late 1980s, Ted Jones was elected to the Supreme Court in Brooklyn, where he would serve one 14-year term and then get reelected to another. In the meantime, a young woman from Mount Vernon was making a name for herself in Westchester. Janet DiFiore was on a single-minded mission. She had decided in high school that she wanted to be a prosecutor in Westchester County. So as a college student at CW Post on Long Island, she interned in the Westchester DA's office. She chose St. John's Law, then in Queens, precisely because she thought it was her best path to that office. As a law student, she interned again in that office, and when she graduated, she was the first ADA hired in the 1981 class. She had what she thought was her dream job. Incidentally, along the way in law school, in fact, on her first day of law school, she met a pushy 3L named Dennis Glazer, who is still her husband, and now also a star professor here at the law school, and it's wonderful that Dennis is with us as well. So here we are in this story. It's 1985. Vito Titone is sitting on the appellate division. Joe Bellicosa has just become chief administrator for the Court of Appeals and the court system. Carmen Ciparick is a sitting Supreme Court judge. Ted Jones is a Court Street lawyer thinking about running for the Supreme Court. And Janet DiFiore is a young ADA in Westchester. The New York Court of Appeals has been in existence for 129 years. St. John's Law has been in existence for 50 years, and there has never been a St. John's grad on the High Court. But 2 other important things have happened. First, in 1977, New York switched by constitutional amendment from the election of Court of Appeals judges to merit selection. And second, in 1983, Mario Cuomo became governor of New York. Now, lest you think there's some St. John's bias here, the first 4 judges Cuomo appointed were from other law schools: Saul Wackler, Dick Simons, no relation, Fritz Alexander, and Judith Kay. But finally, in 1985, he appointed his friend Vito Titone to the High Court. And then 2 years later, in 1987, he appointed his former faculty colleague and friend, Joe Bellicosa. And then 7 years after that, he appointed Carmen Ciparick, the first Hispanic and only the second woman ever to serve on the High Court. And that wasn't an accident. Governor Cuomo had already appointed Judith Kay, the first woman to serve on the court, and he would later make her the first female chief judge of the court. And he would appoint George Bundy Smith, the second ever African American on the court. I'm going to show you a clip from 1985. It's from the press conference where a guy named Mario is announcing the appointment of a guy named Vito. It turns out they would both amount to something. And it's fascinating to watch because it's a little time capsule, both of Mario Cuomo and of relations between politicians and the press that in today's day and age is very different. And in this first clip I want to show you, Governor Cuomo responds to questions from the reporters about diversity in his selection process. So let's watch.
Question, you expressed some disappointment with the list the last time that there were no Italians on it. Were you speaking about this time?
No. I said, each time I said there wasn't enough diversity, I thought. Yeah. And,
Groups that you mentioned.
Yes.
You wanted to see represented.
yeah, women, minorities. I still feel that way. I like lists that have diversity. I mean, we have abundant quality along with diversity. They can exist in the same world in this state. We have them. We have brilliant women, brilliant blacks, brilliant Hispanics, and I was surprised that they weren't able to find any. Yes. Just because I have diversity doesn't mean I choose by race or sex or color. I want the diversity, sure. The way you choose is by quality. And if you give me diversity, then in the natural course of events, the quality will be diversified. That's all. Just give me quality, but make it diverse.
So by 1994, when Judge Ciparick joins the court, greeted here by her old friend and colleague, St. John's Law had gone from never having had a judge on the high court to having three at once. Judge Tatone, Judge Bellicosa, and Judge Ciparick. And what distinguished those judges was not their ethnicity or their politics or their connections to St. John's. It was their dedication to judging, to deciding each case on the facts, to leading the development of the law in predictable and humane ways, to creating an excellent court. And what I'm doing here actually is channeling Mario Cuomo. So why don't I let him explain in his own words what he was looking for when he selected judges. So in this press conference, Cuomo's just been asked a question about the 5 judges that he has appointed, Kay, Simons, Alexander, Tatone, and Wackler, and whether he sees them as a block or as moving the court in a particular direction.
As to the 5 people on the bench, I am not seeking to create an impact that defines them philosophically. This is a liberal court or a progressive court or a conservative court. I want an excellent court, a court of intelligent people who are hardworking, who bring their intelligence and their commitment to every case, who decide the cases clearly, who write the opinions clearly, who give the bar direction, who give it some leadership, who give the law leadership. You see, the court directs the flow of the law, and they can direct it toward humane purposes or not so humane purposes, toward confusion, toward predictability.
So Mario Cuomo wanted an excellent court, and that's what he got. These 3 St. John's Law grads would serve together for several years. Then Judge Tatone retired in 1998. Judge Bellicosa retired in 2000. And that left Judge Ciparick as the lone St. John's representative on the court until 2007, when she was joined by the court's second ever African-American judge. Bundy Smith was the first, Ted Jones. Third. So who was the first? Oh, that's right. That's right. And Judge Ciparick and Judge Jones would serve together for the next 5 years until 2012, when Judge Ciparick reached mandatory retirement age and Judge Jones sadly died unexpectedly from a heart attack. St. John's was left without an alum on the court, and the court was deprived of the wisdom and humanity of a wonderful man who always understood how the legal system impacted regular folk. And that characteristic, understanding how the legal system impacted regular people, could really describe all of the St. John's judges. When Mario Cuomo talked about what he expected from judges, he noted his hope that they would choose to move the law in a more humane direction. And that's what these St. John's judges did. So whether it was Judge Tatone ruling in 1989 that non-traditional households, including gay partnerships, could be considered families for rent control purposes. Or Judge Bellicosa in 1994, railing against the unfairness of a sentencing system that resulted in a 15-year sentence being given to a 17-year-old girl for one sale of 2.3 grams of narcotics. Or Judge Ciparick in 2001, holding landlords accountable for lead paint poisoning. Or Judge Jones, single-handedly ending the 2005 New York City transit strike. Or holding in a groundbreaking case in 2007 that criminal defendants could introduce expert testimony about the reliability of eyewitness identifications. And if you had to draw one theme from the rulings of Titone, Bellicosa, Ciparick, and Jones, it was just that, humanity. Viewing the role of the legal system as serving people. And if there's one other theme in this story, besides opportunity and Mario Cuomo, it's that, service. These judges have devoted themselves before, during, and after they were on the court to serving others and serving the legal profession. Whether it's Judge Ciparick being an officer of and mentor to so many in the Puerto Rican Bar Association, or Judge Bellicosa chairing the ABA section on legal education and admission to the bar, and serving on the board of St. John's Bread and Life in Brooklyn, a wonderful charity to which he recruited Ted Jones later in life. Or Judge Jones chairing the court's diversity committee and chairing, along with the Westchester District Attorney, the Special Justice Task Force on wrongful convictions. In each of those, really in their entire careers, each of these judges was motivated by service. And they have paid it forward by giving back to St. John's. Before we came out here, I recreated that picture, now with Judge DiFiore instead of Judge Jones in it. And their giving back has been legendary. Judge Ciparick has been on the board of our Alumni Association for decades, certainly as long as I've been at St. John's. And Judge Ciparick, you said you started law school in 1964 before most of them were born, before I was born too. Judge Jones was, at the time he died, a member of the St. John's University Board of Trustees, making him my boss, actually making him my boss's boss's boss. And Judge Bellicosa, of course, made the ultimate sacrifice, leaving the court in 2000 to take on a new role, Dean of St. John's Law, at a time when the law school could greatly benefit from his leadership and steady hand. He was my dean when I was a young law professor. He showed me how to be a leader, and he launched me on the path that has brought me and us to this place tonight. And for Judge Bellicosa, becoming dean was coming full circle to the law school that launched him, like it launched Vito Titone and Carmen Ciparick and Ted Jones and Mario Cuomo. Each of those lawyers had an audacious dream and a willingness to take a leap. For Joe, it was believing that a kid from Bed-Stuy whose father was an Iceman could become a lawyer and a law professor and a judge on the highest court of the state. That took multiple leaps of faith, including in 1974 when he moved his family to Albany to be clerk of the court. Now, at that time, his colleague Mario, who was also moving to Albany to be Secretary of State, wrote his friend Joe a note. Now, I have the original of that note here. It's on handwritten stationery, dated 12/21/1974. And it says, Joe, congratulations to you, and I accept your congratulations. It ends by saying, see you in Albany, God bless Mario. But in between, Mario asks a question. Did it occur to you that we may both be making a mistake? Question mark. I'm happy to say that the answer to that question, 45 years later, is still a resounding no. And Joe, you also didn't make a mistake 20 years ago when you said yes to come back to serve the law school as dean. And it's an honor, 15 years after you retired for a second time, to welcome you back to Alma Mater. Now, I have one more duty as part of my presentation, and that's to introduce our final speaker. When I last mentioned Janet DiFiore, she was trying cases as an ADA in Westchester. After doing that for 6 years, she would spend the next 6 years in private practice, then return to the DA's office to be chief of narcotics, then spend 7 years on the bench, being elected first to county court, then to the Supreme Court in Westchester, and then being elected Westchester DA in 2006. She had come to St. John's in 1978 because she wanted to be a Westchester prosecutor. 28 years later, she had become head of that office, her dream job. But 10 years after that, another dream job awaited when, in 2016, Mario Cuomo's son nominated DA DiFiore to be Chief Judge DiFiore, the fifth St. John's Law grad to grace the court and the first to be Chief Judge. 3 years into her new role, the chief has already made her mark. Mario Cuomo wanted an excellent court, and he got it. Chief Judge DiFiore, though, has even bigger ambitions, and that is an excellent court system. She's brought her passion for administration to running and relentlessly improving the $2 billion state court system. And after just 3 years, her excellence initiative has made extensive progress across the state in reducing backlogs, resolving cases, increasing trial capacity, and providing better and more comprehensive service to the public. She's also been a dear friend to St. John's Law, including serving as our commencement speaker in her very first year as Chief Judge. Okay, I'll expand this picture because there are some other judges in the picture. There you go. Hello, Judge Ang and Judge Angelillo, and Judge Rivera. Here's my last picture. This picture of our 3 honorees who are here tonight and some other guy was taken at a Historical Society of New York Courts event a few years ago. And I want to thank the Historical Society for sponsoring tonight with us and for giving us the impetus to put on this program, but really more broadly for all of the work the Society does to preserve the history of New York's courts and to strengthen the bonds among all of us who care about the court system. So, Chief, I'll just say one last thing. I know that your time leading the court system won't end for another 7 years, but be careful, because, and Judge Bellicosa will appreciate this, who knows, by 2026, when you step down from the court, St. John's may need a new dean. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chief Judge Janet DiFiore.
Well, Dean, that was extraordinarily well done. How about a hand for the Dean? Fantastic. Excellent, excellent presentation. So what a great honor it is to be here and to be honored amongst these very distinguished and accomplished alumni. And first, before I begin, I want to add my thanks to the Historical Society and to the Young Lawyers Committee for the work that they have done in law schools throughout the state, but here tonight in bringing this program together. And of course, my favorite dean, Dean Simons, and Professor Barrett, thank you so much. Now, I am fully aware that the bench of accomplished alumni from this law school is very, very deep, and I do want to especially thank the organizers of tonight's event for selecting this particular group to serve as examples of the lawyers and judges who reflect the rich history and traditions of this law school. And to my mind, tonight's celebration of that history and those traditions, the natural place to start for us is where we began, listening to the names of the honorees: Titone, Bellicosa, Beauchamp Ciparick, Jones, Eng, and of course our other participant, Judge Vyskocil. Those names and the histories and the stories behind those names are a testament to the wonderful diversity and inclusive nature of this law school, going back to 1925, when it literally opened the doors to opportunity here for people of every socioeconomic, ethnic, racial, and religious background. affording for folks opportunities that they could never have imagined, and folks from every walk of life. And the accomplishments and the achievements of tonight's alumni reflect, I believe, the special history and traditions here at St. John's Law School. And I do believe that we represent and reflect the dreams, the talent, and the determination of men and women who first in downtown Brooklyn and now, of course, in Jamaica, Queens, received a first-rate legal education and a strong and essential grounding in the values of justice, charity, and service. And speaking of service, the honorees and participants, Eng and Vyskocil, the 7 judges tonight, when their years of service are tallied, that represents 210 years of service devoted to public service, 150 of those years devoted to service in the judicial branch of our government. Extraordinary, and collectively and individually, these people represent the best qualities of our profession. And I can say, as someone who has had the honor and the privilege of knowing them, working with them, and attempting to follow their example as colleague, as friend, as mentor, and as role model, these individuals have set the bar very high, at a place for all of us to aspire to. And how fortunate we have been to know these folks. Teddy Jones, a wonderful lawyer, fabulous trial judge, wonderful associate judge at the Court of Appeals, my fellow co-chair, a man who was so passionate in his devotion to criminal justice reform on the Justice Task Force to make sure we were working hard to reduce the possibility that someone would be convicted of a crime that he or she did not commit. I learned an extraordinary amount from his humility, from his gentility, from his strength. Carmen Beauchamp Ciparick, an absolute trailblazer for women, myself included, and for Puerto Ricans in the judiciary and the legal profession. This is a woman who never stops serving. Not only does she do the Justice Task Force, she chairs the Mayor's Advisory Committee, an extremely important committee populating the bench with competent, dedicated judges. Just this morning, Judge Ciparick testified at the joint legislative hearings that were conducted in Manhattan in support of our latest proposal for a constitutional amendment to simplify the court system. Judge Ciparick never says no, and we are all the better for her service. Thank you, Judge. Judge Bellicosa, a valued mentor and friend to all, and someone I am so happy to have at my back. Judge Bellicosa is a true public citizen. He's a man who has given his heart and his soul to every institution he has served. The unified court system, his beloved Court of Appeals, and his beloved law school. Institutions that are all distinctly better today because of his commitment to service and his devotion to the purity of purpose of each of those institutions. Thank you, Judge. Judge Tatone, someone I wish I had known better, but I did have the privilege of knowing and briefly working with. And aside from our shared pride and interest in all things Italian, I certainly can bear witness, particularly now, to how his legacy and his commitment to justice did indeed add to the excellence of that court and the development of a regular and predictable body of law to the benefit of all of us. And certainly his legacy has continued to challenge us at the court to do our very best in our work. And while not honorees, I do want to say a few things about my dear friend, Justice Eng, a true gentleman, a scholar judge, and a wonderful leader as presiding justice of the busiest appellate court in America. He was a magnificent member of the administrative board which I chair and where we serve together. And he was always forward-leaning and thoughtful in setting the agendas and the policy for the New York State courts. And in terms of my efforts to improve the New York State court system, I could not imagine a greater and more knowledgeable partner to implement and guide our excellence initiative than Justice Eng, and we very much appreciated his work and miss him. And Mary Kay Vyskocil, a wonderful friend and colleague with whom I have shared many experiences, largely celebratory, celebrating all of her achievements, operating and practicing at the highest levels of the law, just a fabulous lawyer and partner at Simpson Thacher, and we were all so thrilled and proud to watch as she ascended the federal bench, and now, God willing, fingers crossed, there are more good things in store for Judge Vyskocil. Every one of these extraordinary individuals who are highlighted this evening, without question, are the beneficiaries of the special, the caring, and the enriching traditions of our law school. And to my mind, this is exactly why our graduates gravitate to the high ideals of public service and public interest law in such impressive numbers and in so many varied and admirable ways. And I do believe that this is why our alums continue to come back and to give back again and again and again, enriching our law school in so many ways by teaching, by mentoring, by hiring, very important, hiring our graduates, by serving on boards and committees and organizations in our community, in government, and by sharing the fruits of their success, endowing needed scholarships, and supporting the law school and its graduates in so many ways. This is who we are, products of this law school, individuals whose training, education, and experiences have shown us the value and the satisfaction of working and living to achieve the highest professional and personal fulfillment, always practicing the Vincentian tradition, I am here for others. In closing, I want to say what a spectacular and totally indulgent evening this has been. And I want to thank all of you for being here, and especially thank all of those who worked so hard to put this program together. Thank you very much.
So before I turn it over to our last speaker, I want to say one other thing about this room and buildings and facilities. There was a lot of references in Barrett's presentation and mine to 96 Schermerhorn Street and then the building in Queens. And the physical plant is a big part of an institution. But of course, it's the people that matter. And the people behind 96 Schermerhorn Street, you saw in Professor Barrett's presentation. It was George Matheson and Philip Brennan. It's wonderful to be having this event here in this room now with Joe Bellicosa sitting here. And we purposely put this event together so that Joe would have to sit and listen to all of us talking about him rather than get a chance for rebuttal. I'm afraid that's probably going to come upstairs when we get to the reception. But Joe was in charge of the move from Brooklyn to Queens. And alums of a certain vintage might be able to picture this room in 1972. It was flat. The bench was over there. It was a big classroom that got used a lot. And that was the law school of Assistant Professor and Assistant Dean Joe Bellicosa. Fast forward to, I don't know, 2002, 2003, something like that. And that room desperately needed renovation. And fortunately, our dean was Joe Bellicosa. And John Barrett mentioned Jerry Belson. And I can still vividly remember the night that the grand opening of the Belson Moot Courtroom. And not the most tech-savvy dean, still managing to demonstrate all the fancy technology in the room to the assembled masses. But more importantly, through his relationship with Jerry, Dean Bellicosa had stewarded the gift that paid for this. And it's a wonderful physical manifestation of legacy. Jerry Belson's legacy, to be sure, but Joe Bellicosa's legacy as well. And particularly the two parts of this room, the 1972 version and the 2002 version. And it's wonderful to be here tonight with Joe to celebrate. We'll also repair from here to the fourth floor, to the beautiful atrium bearing the name of Joseph Matone, who was really the third of those three amigos who would hang out at 96 Skirmahorn Street along with Titone and Cuomo, waiting for, actually they would get there early for the evening classes, or waiting for the female students who were in, I think, the School of Ed, and they could overlap for about an hour, and all three of them together met their wives. And we'll get to go to the Matone Atrium for the reception to conclude this event. And before we do that, I want to call on our final speaker, another trustee of the Historical Society, even though she is a federal judge, St. John's alumnus, Mary Kay Vyskocil.
So as Michael said, my job tonight is really just to give a couple of closing remarks, which really means I'm what stands in the way of your getting upstairs for the reception. So I will do my best to be very brief. Tonight's event was really just spectacular, and it brings together two institutions that are very dear and special to me, St. John's Law School and the Historical Society of the New York State Courts. So I want to speak for a minute. I'm just delighted to see so many students and perhaps young alumni in the crowd here. So I want to just speak to you briefly for a moment. If you are students or young alums of the law school, I hope tonight has made you as proud as it's made me to be an alumni of this law school. If you're not an alumni of St. John's, and you're just here because you have an affinity for the Court of Appeals or because you love legal history, I hope we've given you a sense of the enduring legacy of St. John's and its impact on the Court of Appeals and on the development of the law in New York State. Now, the mission of the Historical Society, which really is the organization that's sponsoring tonight's event, hasn't really gotten talked about a lot, so I just want to read it to you. The mission of the Historical Society is to preserve, protect, and promote the legal history of New York, including the proud heritage of its courts and the development of the rule of law. Now, those of us at St. John's who are privileged to serve as trustees of the Historical Society have been talking for some time about putting together an event that we would hold here at St. John's. And it's about 4 years ago that the Historical Society inaugurated its New York Law School Presents series. And this is the third in that series of events. The first was held 4 years ago in Buffalo, and it featured prominent women in New York legal history. Several years later, Albany held a program, and its theme was Illustrious Alumni of Albany Law School. So I'm very, very proud that we were finally able to put our event on here at St. John's, and I can't think of a better way for us to have started than to feature our deep connection to the New York Court of Appeals. But I will say, and you've heard a little bit about this tonight, that we also have many, many, many prominent alumni who have contributed to the development of the law in New York, to protection of the rule of law, and to public service. We've had people who have served on courts throughout the New York State court system. We've even had some judges on the federal bench, as you've heard. We have many people who have served as district attorneys throughout New York State. We've had a director of the Central Intelligence Agency. We've had police commissioners, fire commissioners, prominent practicing lawyers who, through their advocacy, have helped to develop the rule of law. So, while we have much that we have celebrated tonight, I hope that we can be back in the not too distant future for part 2 of Illustrious Alumni of St. John's. So I thank you all for being here.